This lecture is about aggregate planning and master planning. Here's an overview of the sales and operations planning process. One thing that the sales and operations planning process will produce is an aggregate plan, and it will produce some other plans as well. One point that I'd like to make is that the demand forecast is an important input to this process. An aggregate plan looks a lot like a demand forecast. It's this aggregate plan is a statement of essentially what we're going to make when, but we don't always make and sell things at the same time. Very often we build up inventory ahead of time, or we do other things so that we don't have to make exactly what the market wants when the market wants it. The forecast is a statement of what the market wants and when it wants it. But if you think about something like Halloween costumes as a fairly extreme example, we don't make them when consumers want to buy them. We probably make them slowly over time ahead of time and get them all ready for the time when they're going to be demanded. Each of the four plans has to be consistent with the other plans. As it says here, if marketing plans to sell 10,000 units in a given time period, then operations has to plan on making 10,000 units or carry some units into inventory and make the difference. The really key thing is here, if there's disconnects between the plans, then the plans need to be adjusted. In this case, either the marketing plan needs to be adjusted or the operations plan needs to be adjusted. The plans have to be consistent with one another, and there's also various objectives and constraints that the plans need to meet. For example, a company only has so much available cash. At Micron, for example, there's a fairly large group that evaluates the impact of potential aggregate plans on the company's cash flow. Keep in mind that that's a pretty capital-intensive industry, and a particular aggregate plan may necessitate going out and buying new capital equipment, may wind up tying up a lot of cash in inventory, and so on. The company's going to have other objectives in terms of customer service levels. In other words, a tolerable level of stockouts and what's an intolerable level of stockouts, profitability objectives, those types of things. If the plans don't meet those objectives, then again the plans have to be redone, revised until they do. Here's just an overview of some of the constraints and some of the different objectives that sales and operations planning has to work within. Other companies may have others, but this is a fairly representative list. Services is a slightly different aggregate planning environment. One important element of an aggregate plan is inventory. As I mentioned previously, companies may choose to build up inventory ahead of demand in a lot of cases, but services generally can't do that. In manufacturing, companies have this really great thing called inventory that's basically a receptacle for value. We can build value in advance or add value in advance and basically store that value in this thing called inventory. But you can't inventory a haircut, right? So services can't do that. So services generally have to chase demand a little bit more than manufacturing companies, although some services can have back orders. You may call the plumber, and the plumber says, sorry, I'll get there in 3 days, right? Services can also use other demand shifting techniques and other tools aimed at managing demand, things like reservation, waiting rooms, contra-seasonal products. For example, a shop that sells lawnmowers might also sell snowmobiles or snowblowers or something like that. As your book mentions, manufacturers have a lot of different options for adjusting capacity, and service businesses do too. They can use overtime, they can use temporary labor, they can lay people off, they can make adjustments to equipment, and all those kinds of things. There are two basic aggregate planning strategies that are sort of archetypal. One is called a level strategy, the other is called a chase strategy. And here I've got some illustrative examples of a level strategy to start out with. And you can see in each one of these examples, and by the way, it's probably very helpful to print out a copy of the spreadsheet if you haven't done so already. We've got a monthly plan, and I've got 12 months here in the plan. That's this column here, that's a row that says period, and then we've got the forecast, and you can see here that the forecast varies from month to month. It starts out low, gets high, and then goes back down kind of low again. And then we've got planned production, and planned production, as the name kind of suggests here, level aggregate plan. Planned production is level. We're planning on making 100 units a month. You can see that in total, we're planning on selling in our forecast 1,200 units a month, and we're going to plan on making 1,200 units a month. So you can see what impact that has on inventory and what impact that has on back orders. We start out making 100 units a month. We're only selling 50 units a month here in periods 1 through 4, so we're building up inventory. Then we start selling 200, 150, 200 beginning in month 5, and you can see that inventory starts to go down, and in month 7 we start to run a backlog of 50 orders. If these numbers aren't big enough for you, as always, you're welcome to add some zeros. Our backlog goes up again in month 8, month 9. Then we begin to catch up again in month 10 when we're making 100 and only selling 50. And in month 12 we catch completely back up. So again, we have a forecast for 1,200. We plan to make 1,200, but because we're making the same amount every month and we're not selling the same amount every month, inventory varies. And that's really the key for a level aggregate plan, is production is level, inventory varies. It goes up, it goes down, sometimes it goes negative into a backlog situation. Here, this is our average inventory in cell P7 here, and you can see our average inventory is 23 units a month. Here's another example of a level aggregate plan down here beginning in cell B9. Again, we're not carrying any inventory into the plan. That's what this cells here in column C are. But here we're going to make a little bit more than we sell, and the reason we're going to do that is because we don't ever want to have a backlog. In other words, we don't ever want to have negative inventory. We never want to turn a customer away. In other words, we never want to tell that customer, sorry, we won't be able to fill your order until next month. So we're going to have to make 113 units every month, and you can see inventory really builds here. Inventory builds up to 252, and then we draw it the whole way down to 4 units, and it starts to build back up again. The good news here, again, is that we never have to tell a customer, sorry, we can't get to you till next month or 2 months from now. The bad news is, as you can see by comparing the inventory in these two plans, the inventory in the second plan is quite a bit higher. The average inventory is 101 instead of 23 for the other plan. Now we also might plan on carrying inventory into the period, and that's what we're doing here in this third aggregate plan. We're carrying 100 units of inventory in. So if we make 100 units a month, again, we'll never go negative. We'll never have a backlog, but our average inventory, again, is going to be quite a bit higher. So those are 3 different kind of variations on level aggregate plans. Those are what your book calls reactive options, where you're using inventory and backlog to deal with fluctuations in demand. I've also got a couple examples of chase aggregate plans here. Now, chase aggregate plan is the complete flip side of the level aggregate plan. In a chase aggregate plan, we're chasing demand, so we always make what the market wants when the market wants it. In other words, we always plan to make the forecast. So you can see here in this one, we've got actually the same forecast we had in our level plans, but the difference is planned production. Planned production is exactly the same as the forecast. As a result of that, our inventory doesn't change. If you're always making exactly what the market's going to absorb, then you're never adding to your inventory, you're never taking away from your inventory. So our planned inventory here is constant. In this case, it's constant at 0. In the second example, we're just planning on carrying 50 units of inventory into the period. again, we don't add to the inventory, we don't take away from the inventory because we're chasing, so our inventory just stays level here at 50 units. Finally, we have a level aggregate plan, but we've done some demand shifting. Here's our original forecast. This is the same forecast we've been using. I'm sorry, this is our original forecast, the same forecast we've been using in all the other examples. But what's happened is operations and finance and marketing have gotten together, and marketing has agreed that they can do some shifting of the demand. They can do some specials, some promotions, some things like that, and incentivize customers to buy during some of the non-peak periods. So we're kind of smoothing out the demand. You can see we've taken the 200s and moved some of the demand from the 200s and even some of the 150s into some of the periods that were 50s before. So the demand now is quite a bit smoother. We still have to produce the same amount. We're still going to do level production of 100 like we did in all our level strategies up above. But the difference is the backlogs are not going to be as extreme. You can see that if you compare this forecast, or I'm sorry, this aggregate plan to the very first aggregate plan that we took a look at. So let's summarize the differences between chase and level aggregate planning, and then let's talk about the conditions when one might make sense over the other. So with chase production, our planned production varies. With level production, our production is level. It stays the same. With chase, our planned inventory is stable. So remember, we're always making what the market wants when the market wants it, so we don't add to that inventory, we don't subtract to that inventory. With level production, our planned inventory, remember, is going to vary. As a matter of fact, if you graphed it out, you'd see it looks something like that if you took the time to graph some of those spreadsheets that we looked at before. So, when do these different things make sense? Well, in some industries, the costs of idling and restarting equipment are high, particularly your capital-intensive industries, your chemical refineries, oil refineries, those types of industries, breweries, circuit fabrication facilities, those types of things. And those types of facilities are going to try to level schedule as much as they can to avoid the cost of idling and restarting equipment. So again, if those costs are high, we're going to tend to level schedule. Other operations, like operations that are more assembly focused and that kind of thing, it doesn't really cost very much to start them up and shut them down, so they can afford to chase. So if the costs are lower, that makes chase scheduling more feasible. Let's kind of think about the labor force in terms of the skill of the labor force, and that kind of correlates with the cost of recruiting and training. If the skill of the labor force is high, we don't want to be laying those people off, etc., because we might lose them. So we're going to tend to level schedule. Again, if our labor force is skilled, we'll tend to level schedule. If they're less skilled, we'll tend to chase. Recruiting and training costs are the same thing. If it costs a lot to recruit folks, if it costs a lot to train folks, we don't want to be laying them off and then bringing them back. We certainly don't want to be hiring and firing them. So if those costs are high, we'll try to level schedule. If those costs are lower, then we can afford to chase schedule. Let's think about inventory carrying costs. In some situations, materials are expensive to carry in inventory, either because they're high-value materials themselves, or because they're highly perishable, like a food-type product, or because the risk of obsolescence is high. There's a lot of reasons why materials can be expensive to carry in inventory. Remember, inventory is usually a key part of level scheduling. We're going to be building up some pretty high inventories generally in some parts of the year. So if materials are expensive, we probably want to avoid doing level scheduling. We probably want to lean more towards chase scheduling, to making what the market wants when it wants it, so we can keep our inventories under control. So again, if materials are expensive to carry, that kind of argues for chase scheduling. If materials aren't so expensive to carry, then that enables level scheduling. Okay, the last thing we want to think about is switching costs. Switching costs aren't often as relevant in a lot of the consumer products that you and I are real familiar with, but there are a few. Like, for example, if you buy a Hewlett-Packard printer, you're kind of locked into Hewlett-Packard ink. The only way you can switch from one manufacturer's ink cartridge to another is to buy a printer from somebody else. So your switching costs, or the cost of buying a new printer, those are pretty high. In business-to-business commerce, we tend to get locked in a lot easier. Maybe we design a particular manufacturer's component into our product, and we're kind of locked into that manufacturer, and it would cost us quite a bit to switch from one manufacturer's component to another. So if switching costs are high for our customers, we may be able to basically force our customers to wait for us to ship their orders sometimes. We may be able to kind of force a backlog situation. So again, if switching costs are high for those customers, then that enables another aspect of level production, which is back orders or backlogs. On the other hand, if there aren't a lot of barriers for customers to switch from us to our competitors, we may want to lean more towards chase type production, to giving them what they want when they want it, so they don't defect and go to a competitor. So if the switching costs for customers are low, we're going to tend more towards chase production. Now notice I've been saying we're going to tend more to do one than the other, because in reality there aren't a whole lot of businesses that are pure level schedulers or are pure level or pure chasers. Generally, most companies are going to be somewhere in between, but also it's true to say that most companies are going to tend to be more one way than the other way. Except for some service businesses, of course, that are basically forced to chase. That brings us to master planning. I just want to spend a minute on master planning. A master plan is basically like an aggregate plan, except it doesn't look out as far in time, but it's more detailed. It's more detailed in a couple of ways. One way is that whereas aggregate planning or aggregate plans are generally stated in monthly increments, master plans are typically stated in weekly increments, or what we call time buckets, sometimes even daily time buckets. Also in a master plan, the product level that you're planning at is less aggregated. Remember, in an aggregate plan, we're typically planning some kind of composite product, a typical product, or we're planning our overall output, in pounds or dollars or something like that. Whereas in a master plan, we typically plan at the level in which the product is sold. So if we sell, a 12-ounce package and a 24-ounce package, we're going to have a line in our master plan for a 12-ounce package and a 24-ounce package. If we make 5 different flavors, we're going to have a line in our master plan. In other words, a separate master plan for each different flavor. If we make furniture and we make a 36-inch round oak table and a 48-inch rectangular cherry table, we're going to have a separate master plan for each one of those, whereas at the aggregate planning level, we'd probably just have one aggregate plan or one for each one of those examples that I just mentioned. It is important to note that the master plan is constrained by the aggregate plan. If we've got an aggregate plan that says we'll make 100,000 units in February, we're probably not going to be able to master plan to make more than 100,000 units in the 4 weeks that make up February. Why is that? Well, we've made a lot of resource decisions based on the aggregate plan. Resources that take longer to get, particularly capital resources and some classes of labor, highly skilled labor. We've gone out. We can't get those resources in the very short term. So we've made those decisions based on our aggregate plan. We've got those resources. They're ready to go. But we probably can't get more of those resources in a short time frame. So the master plan is constrained by the aggregate plan. just like an aggregate plan, as the last bullet point says here, the master plan has to be checked against constraints. It has to be checked against objectives. We've got capacity constraints, and when we get down to the master planning level, we're probably going to check at a more detailed level against all those capacity constraints. And we've got service level objectives, other objectives, and we also want to check to make sure that the master plan achieves those objectives.